complicated, you know, man. Like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Buck Johnson, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm good, man. Thank you for having me here on the Jay Burden Show.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you on. I've been a somewhat sporadic listener of your podcast, but I was kind of doing the math, and I realized that I've been listening to your show off and on for, I mean, well over 2 years now. So I'm glad to finally talk with you face to face, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, picture to picture.
Yeah, exactly right. As face to face as you can over the internet.
Right.
So for people in my audience who maybe aren't as familiar with you, could you describe just very briefly kind of who you are and what you do on the internet?
Sure. Well, my name's Buck Johnson. I'm living in Lockhart, Texas. I've been a firefighter in a city that I will not disclose for over 25 years. I'm a lieutenant in that position. And outside of that, I'm an Orthodox Christian and a podcaster with the show Counterflow Podcast. It used to be called, I don't know if you listen, I don't know, I can't remember the exact timeline of when I switched, but it used to be called Death to Tyrants. It was strictly, I would say, anarcho-capitalist, right-wing style of politics. I was a strict atheist, and now here I am, not a libertarian, an Orthodox Christian, not a libertarian, as I would say correctly, and doing the Counterflow Podcast and doing just loving life.
So how did you get into the kind of liberty sphere? I mean, I'll put it this way. I'm kind of a generation below you. I'm Gen Z. And so to me, a lot of my influences growing up were guys in their 30s and 40s who were, involved in the anti-war movement, were kind of either holdovers from the paleocons or kind of, new converts in the Ron Paul era. But how did you get started there?
That's why I like Gen Z. You guys are better than millennials in my experience so far. Yeah, I'm about to be 47. In high school, towards the end of high school. Well, for one, I was into punk rock, skinhead subculture stuff in high school. And towards the end of high school, this might sound funny to some of the people listening, especially you probably being a Gen Z, that the internet became a thing, not massively widespread, but started growing. So I had it, and I somehow stumbled upon secession movements on the internet. And I got into somewhat dissident style political stuff with secession, and I started attending, conferences and whatnot. And this is I'm not dog whistling if anyone's listening. It was like legitimate conferences. It wasn't some underground thing with a bunch of hillbillies. And I ended up moving to Austin, Texas. I'm a musician as well. So I got deep into the music scene in Austin, and I've toured all across the country and world multiple times. And when I moved to Austin, I found Alex Jones on public access TV. Then before you know it, he was on there was an FM radio station in Austin that was only talk radio and pretty much all conspiracy right-wing type stuff. So I discovered Ron Paul through Alex Jones. He had a show on there, Alex did, and my friend Jack Blood had a show. Lots of good stuff. It was good memories back then, just driving around in the afternoons, hearing that kind of thing on FM radio. And I got into libertarianism through that. Through the years, I played multiple gigs for Ron Paul during the 2008 campaign and the 2012 campaign with a guitar singer, blues guy named Jimmy Vaughn, who's the brother of Stevie Ray Vaughan. And he was a massive Ron Paul guy. And so that got us in because he was kind of famous. So Ron wanted us to do things. So I was always plugged in a little bit to the Ron Paul revolution stuff. I was making homemade signs before they were selling them broadly. I mean, that was a true grassroots thing at the time. That's looking back, it's funny to imagine a campaign that caught that much fire, not putting out their own signage. But I think part of the charm of the first run was that it was so grassroots that we were all making the signage, and we'd have these nights where we'd go around once the sun went down and put signs all over the city of Austin. So those were fun times. And then through, let's see, I guess once the podcasting started becoming something, I found those, and I found Tom Woods, at the time, Jason Stapleton, then Dave Smith, and started listening to that orbit of libertarianism. I was always dialed in with the Mises Institute libertarians more so than the Reason and Cato and whatnot. And I just thought one day, wow, I think if I could do a podcast, I'm already a musician, so I was familiar with the recording process and things of that nature. It wasn't foreign to me. Having an audience wasn't foreign to me. I thought if I could do a podcast, maybe I'll meet Tom Woods, and maybe I'll meet Ron Paul, and I'll meet Lou Rockwell and Jeff Deist and these people that I hear on other shows, Dave Smith, Jason Stapleton, all who I've just listed, I got to meet. And I thought I'll interview them and put it out there, and my musician friends, all these people that know me will hear it, and they will realize libertarianism is what's best. It sounds funny saying that looking back now. That did not necessarily happen as far as convincing left-wing musician crowd. But I kept on with the podcast, and I did get to meet a lot of my heroes and become friends with people. You mentioned before we got to airing that Pete introduced you to my show. I became friends with Pete Quinones. I like Pete a lot. We've hung out many times. And so I just got deep into this podcast thing, and slowly but surely things happened, as everyone knows, over 2020 and 2021, which led me down a spiritual route that I did not expect to go down. But I started looking around thinking, I don't think that atheism is correct, because there's some really demonic things happening right now. And it's not just an incompetent government like John Stossel would have taught us. The people could be incompetent, but there's some seriously dark demonic forces at play here, despite what the goofballs on the TV look like. And that led me to the Orthodox Church. And so it wasn't a direct design in my podcast to where I said, my podcast is not libertarian or right wing, it's Orthodox. It's changed as I have. And so it continues to do so.
So it's interesting. My early, memories of politics are somewhat similar, but for me, it's Rush Limbaugh. I remember driving around in my granddad's truck, listening to Rush Limbaugh, and you kind of cover several eras there, right? Like that kind of,
yeah.
And I don't even say naive in a bad way, because I think it came from a very good place. But that idea that, it's like civics class. It's like you were taught in high school. People just don't know, or they haven't heard the argument right. So we'll do it. We'll sidestep the traditional avenues. We'll make the best argument possible. And it didn't work. And you kind of can't blame anyone for trying,
No doubt.
That route hadn't been tried within living memory. So it's like, all right, we'll run this again. And I think that it kind of speaks to, your honesty and the fact that you actually have adjusted with the times, because I think that every once in a while you interact with these people who are kind of fossils. Like every once in a while I'll get into some kind of like argument with like 2006 style atheists again, who just like have like, they're almost like fossilized in amber. It's like Encino Man, and it's like they walk out and it's like nothing has happened, nothing has changed.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And in all of that, right, that idea that the pure discourse of just proving your arguments doesn't matter. Okay, so that's one. But then that second part, that effectively, the real contention here is it's good versus evil, but not simply like good versus evil in kind of an earthly sense, right? There's actually something much bigger than this going on, and to kind of reduce it to a simple like R versus D political issues, it's reductive. It's incredibly reductive. And I think that, and take this for what it's worth, but there is almost an advantage to living in the times we do now.
I agree.
And I talk about this with Gen Z, because by any metric, Gen Z is doing very poorly on average. But at the same time, we sort of don't have the advantage of living in an era when kind of the lie of broader culture is going well,
Right.
Like say what you will, but when George W.'s in office, it's very easy to kind of fall for that, that kind of like rationalist argument of essentially just like, well, the real problem is Christians, basically, not to
Yes.
put too fine a point on it,
Right.
because he's not a good guy. And you can say, well, okay, the opposite of that, or the opposite of what he's pretending to be, must be good. Whereas now it's like the kind of mainstream position is flagrantly and apparently like demonic and off-putting. So sorry, back to you, Buck.
No, I mean, I think that's right. The last several years have been, despite the horrible things that happened, I mean, I couldn't be more grateful for it, because it's led me to where I'm at in Orthodox Church. It's just, and it's funny because I call it the age of revelation. People revealed who they are. Not everyone, but a lot of people, good and bad, revealed who they truly are. And it's just really that the clamps came down on us a little bit. I mean, for a first world wealthy country and a bunch of spoiled people that we are, that seemed like the end of the world. But plenty of generations of Americans have been through much worse than what would happen in 2020 and 2021. But just that little clamp down revealed a lot of things to us. It revealed to me the good and evil that you're discussing. And I find it so, like you said, it's like a fossil of an argument to when someone still to this day is just like, yep, just those Democrats or something. And it's like, to argue only the politics of it is so surface level that it's beyond pointless. In fact, it's not just pointless. It's, I would say, harmful, because you're missing the larger context. And that's kind of what led me to the church to begin with. Is I would interview Ben Armani, who goes by Cyprian now, and offline, I think he was offline. I'd have to go back and look if it was on a show, but he said to me, if you're looking at what's happening with COVID and these lockdowns, and you're just looking at it from a materialist standpoint and trying to fight it through the political realm, you've missed the entire point of everything that's happening right now. It's all spiritual, and it's all way above these powers and principalities that play here. It's beyond all of that. And that's when I was like, wow, yeah, I think it is. And it had started to hit me, but the way he phrased it, it kind of punched me in the stomach. Like, okay, what am I doing then? Like talking about the legalities of the lockdown and whatnot. And so through this craziness, it actually helped me find more truth. And I think if you're just floating through good times, being a happy-go-lucky libertarian prior to 2020, which was me, by the way, it's real easy just to have fun arguments online and just say, well, if I can just convince more people, XYZ will happen, until that one little minor clampdown. Again, in 2020, that's not really, it was certainly not the end of the world, and things have been and could get much worse. It took just that little bit to wake a lot of people up and go, wait a second, this isn't about convincing the most amount of people for liberty. Look around. They don't want it. It's very clear. They don't only not want it, they don't want me to have it. And if I have a gathering at my house, they will work for free as an arm of the state and call the cops and report me. So a lot of lessons were learned, and that's how it's gone throughout history. Look at communism and us, and how many saints and martyrs were born out of that. I'm not trying to get too orthodox for your audience and bore them, but through events like the Bolshevik Revolution and communism at large, a lot of wonderful saints were born out of that. So there's always silver linings to horrible things.
Well, I think that one of there's kind of a completely beat to death argument, like, oh, woke is a religion, the kind of like modern set of social beliefs. And I ended up writing an essay about this not long ago, so I won't get into that. I've made my opinions known somewhere else. But I think that it was valuable because you're right. Ultimately, COVID wasn't as bad as it could have been.
Right.
But I think that it served a valuable lesson in a lot of people's minds, because it showed them that power, right? Whoever is in power doesn't just want to control you, which I think is a perspective that a lot of people operate on, but they actively detest you. Yes. And they will do things that are nonsensical to essentially rub your nose in that.
Yes.
And I think that seeing that kind of irrational hatred is actually it's a helpful framing device, because, and look, like, I come from an economics background. It's what I studied in school. It's what I do in my day job. And that purely materialistic way of analysis, right? Where it's everyone is just maximizing their personal kind of like material gain.
Mm-hmm.
Very clearly flounders when you get to a situation where it's like this kind of war of beliefs. It is almost a holy war in the sense that it's not that you are doing this out of material need. You're doing it essentially because these two systems of belief cannot coexist. They're mutually exclusive. And I think that a lot of people were kind of drinking the Kool-Aid on the idea of pluralism, the idea that like, oh, we can just all live together.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was that was a narrow end of the wedge, right? Like, you use that to essentially get into a predominantly Christian culture, right? And obviously, it was never particularly a united Christian culture, at least not for the past, 150, 200 years. But nonetheless, right, there was kind of a generally accepted set of kind of common principles. And that pluralism is a good way to get in the door. But the problem is, once that new civic religion has taken its place, well, the pretense of pluralism is dropped. That was not and you see this with, and I'm not going to mention particular people on this, but you see this with people who are kind of obsessed with that idea of finding contradictions in arguments. Like, oh, this is not being fairly applied.
Right.
And I think that much like that hatred is irrational. To be honest, feelings don't care about your facts. Like, this isn't a debate club. It's kind of it is a genuine culture war. And look, again, like, I'm not a Republican, I'm not, rah vote for the GOP by any means. But I do think that it's almost much like you said that it revealed a lot about individual people. I think it revealed a lot about the fractures in culture that we had kind of wallpapered over, so to speak.
Yes. I remember when Trump got elected, and I guess I was naive to what was going on as far as just under the surface, just like this bubbling tension, I suppose. But I remember seeing the freakouts that we've all seen now. You can watch YouTube reels and highlights of these crazy people going nuts and crying and screaming and passing out. And I just thought, what on earth did Barack Obama do to this country? And I don't know that that's the correct analysis, but I couldn't stop thinking it because it was so irrational, and it caught me completely off guard. I thought, well, yeah, there's going to be some people upset, just like there is every election, but not to that extent. And then the marches with the hats and just this insanity. I kept thinking, what did he do to this country for 8 years to like atrophy our heart or our spine or our backbone? Like, everyone just was weak and flipped out. And I think those things, again, it's kind of like the 2020 stuff I was talking about. That's a good thing, because if it's real and it's there, I'd rather understand and know that that's how things are. I don't want this Band-Aid over everything, this Barack Obama Band-Aid. Hillary Clinton had to lose, and Trump had to win. I still think that, because that showed it's a reality check on where things are and where this culture is. 2020 had to happen. It also was a reality check. The medical mandate intervention that they tried to do had to happen. And the more these like kind of shocks to the system happen, I think it's revealing and telling. And I'd rather work off of legitimate, real knowledge on what culture and society are like than this pretend stuff that you see on the TV.
It's interesting you bring up Obama, because I think one of my first very strong kind of memories of a political event is of the race leading up to Obama, his first term.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was still in grade school, but I remember it, you know, nonetheless. And looking back on it, what I think is interesting about that is that Obama was, for a lot of people, I think subconsciously, that was their heaven on earth. They did it.
They called him a messiah.
Yes, and he acted like that. But the interesting thing is, you know, like any kind of earthly messiah, right? It didn't turn out right.
Right.
And so I think that the move towards this kind of vindictive, like true hatred of, you know, as they would say, the chuds, right, is kind of, and actually to bring up the Soviet example, right, it's the idea of the wreckers, you know, that, well, we did it, you know, we had our revolution, you know, we ended racism, we put a black man in the Oval Office,
right,
and then, you know, everyone kind of hold their breath and wait, we're still at war in the Middle East, you know, we don't have free healthcare. What, you know, like, what the hell? And much like that, you know, you essentially have to turn that frustration somewhere. And effectively, it's been turned on this kind of like mysterious outer force, right? These are the people who are kind of like injecting sin into the world. And so I think that it really is at the core, that may be the root of that difference in worldview, right? Which is, one, is man perfectible, right? Like, can we make a new Soviet man? And maybe this is overly theological, because I
not for me, it's not.
I realize I come from a Calvinist tradition, and you as an Orthodox, we may have very different answers on this, right? But nonetheless, the idea that is kind of like is flaw inherent to what it is to be on earth, right? Or is it the fault of, like, everything would be perfect, you know, Obama would be reigning, you know, America would be a land of milk and honey, except for systematic racism, right? Or closet white supremacists, right? Maybe that's, and I guess that's a very Thomas Sowell dichotomy there, but sorry, back to you, Buck.
Well, it goes, I still think it goes back. I do this, I tend to do this now, I guess being Orthodox, but this goes back to the age old, I mean, this is spiritual warfare, and evil doesn't look inwardly. Evil looks outwardly. So of course, it's like the eye of Sauron, just watching everything, right? Like Obama and that spirit, I don't even mean him as a vessel necessarily, but that spirit and what that all represented, they're never going to look inwardly and say, well, here's what we need to fix. Of course, it's outwardly. That's what evil does. It attacks the other. And so that's why people like you, I suppose, and myself are looked at as whatever you want to call it, deplorables, the enemy, backwards. We represent what they hate, because they hate really what's inside themselves. And so, I mean, I can say with a clear conscience, I don't hate them at all. You know, I as crazy it might sound, say I pray for these type of people, and it's not out of a vanity or like I'm better than them and I feel sorry that I'm so great and they're so horrible. It's not that at all. But when you have a spirit of evil that sweeps over things, it's always going to push back on the outward and blame others for what's negative. And that's because everyone, like we said, looked at him as a Messiah. Well, that's very thin, because a human being can't be the Messiah. We understand that. And when he's looked at one and it quickly turns within just a couple of years, wait a second. You know, that's when you saw the Bernie surge happen, of course, too. It's like the lefties thought, well, this isn't the guy I thought he was. It's like, right, because you thought he was a god on earth, and there's no such thing as that. So, of course, that's going to fail. They didn't look at it in those terms, but that's what happened. And so they all move further left as Obama keeps his wars going and doesn't give free health care, all the things that the quote unquote grassroots left wanted. So they move towards Bernie. Obama becomes, you know, less and less popular. The Hillary split happens in that party. Things just start going wrong because they're not gods, but they act like it. That's a problem. And it's age old. It's the selling your soul, the crossroads story. But that somehow made room for, again, a shock to the system in 2016 that I think had to happen.
And you bring up that idea about kind of praying for these people, right? And I think that, again, going back to that idea of the state religion is so, and sorry, I'm using this phrase to kind of refer to the system, the number of beliefs you have to sign on to be a client of the regime, right? You know which ones I'm talking about.
Yeah, luxury beliefs, I call them.
Right, those are the people who embody them are so manifestly miserable. They're so manifestly unhealthy. The easiest one is the trans one, right? Yep. Obviously, you're mutilating themselves.
Right.
But I think that it's part of the reason you see so many young men, kind of on the radical right as traditionalists, whatever you want to say for, the not woke side of things, people interested in religion or these kind of older ideas, is because just asking that question of like, okay, well, what should I, like, who is my role model? What is there for me to do, in this system of beliefs? And it's basically either like sit down, shut up, and don't do anything, or it's get on hormones. To be honest, it's like, I'd like to say like, oh, the reason I'm interested in ideas greater than myself is because, there's something special in me. That might be true, but I think there's another part of it that it's functionally not an option to go along to get along for a lot of people. And I mean, I think that plays to our advantage.
Yeah. I mean, it's either take hormones or renounce your white, skin or whatever. It's
right. Just like take this, like, and I'm not a huge white identitarian or anything.
No,
but
same.
It's like,
but they're the opposite of that. They're telling you that you're bad because of it. So,
well, right. And it's like, it's just flagrantly, it's embarrassing. Like, that's just the best way to say it, And I think that a lot of the reason that I started, kind of my brief journey into the libertarian sphere is that it felt like there were two options for me, right? I could be liberal, or I could be, an embarrassing boomer Republican.
Right.
And it's like, well, what's your other option? I guess maybe this weird third one. And it's like, well, at least I can kind of be smart. I don't know. Sorry, over psychologizing this.
No, I do the same thing. And I'm wondering, like, when this boomery type spirit, my friend Matt Erickson that does the Real King Pill podcast has been covering this a lot. And I keep thinking about it as he's going on about it, and the way he's articulating things is this boomer spirit's dying off. That's the regime. That's the thing that's going down swinging. It's broke. It's on a house of cards. It's extending itself. All of the things really that Ron Paul said about it are happening. More so maybe culturally, like Pat Buchanan spoke on and some of the paleocons, but it is happening, and that's dying off. Now, the Gen X, which is my people, that seems to be like the punk rock aesthetic and the middle finger to the system. I think Tucker falls in that category. It's like a punk rock, like I said, spirit without the left-wing punk rock that some of those types have. But it's like Trump has a little bit of it, even though he's a boomer. I think Tucker Carlson has it. I think Elon Musk has it. I think Alex Jones has it. And it does feel to me like there's a Gen Z component to want some of that, because the boomer world that Gen Z is now inheriting isn't working. And unfortunately, the boomers have held on to power and money and the establishment and the regime so long that they haven't given Gen X the property to manage yet, if so to speak. And so it feels like this Gen X wave is coming up to basically flip the tables over and push all of this boomer spirit out of the picture in what could be a brighter, significant future for Gen Z. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I've actually, and this is one of the very first podcasts I did that did well, was actually on this exact topic. And that was, I kind of have this running hypothesis that Gen Z and Gen X are kind of spiritually linked. Yeah, there's a real compatibility there.
Yes.
I think one of them is the humor is actually pretty similar.
Yes, that's exactly what Matt's been talking about on King Pill, this exact stuff.
Yeah, like as you could probably tell, like I have a clip from King of the Hill in my intro,
Right.
which
Yep.
is, I mean, that show was on when I was alive, but it's by a Gen Xer and has very much that sensibility. You know, same thing with like Beavis and Butthead or anything else.
Right.
That,
yep.
you know,
Yeah, he lives in Austin, by the way, Mike Judge. I've met him a few times. But yeah, his spirit's very Gen X.
Right. And obviously, you know, Zoomer humor is I don't know if I'd wish it on my worst enemies, but it's certainly something. But it has a kind of a similar sensibility to it. And I think that despite their protestations, I think that the millennials and the baby boomers are very linked. And they're linked by this sort of genuine idealism.
Yes.
Whereas I think that Gen X is incredibly cynical, and there's this, I think the term is hyper sincerity, which is essentially this idea that, you know, Gen Z is so thoroughly coded in irony that it kind of loops back around. So essentially being kind of completely and totally saturated in, I don't even know what you'd call it, but in kind of like nihilism and
it's
rebellion.
That. Yep.
And I think that part of that is that if you look at the numbers, a lot of Gen Z has Gen X parents, right? Like my parents are they're 48 or 49 now. Point is, right? So like in that same age bracket.
They're my peers. Great. Okay.
Yeah. Well, they had kids young, so it's not that weird. Yeah. But point is, either way, I think that that's some of it. But I think also a part of it is that kind of feeling of growing up in someone else's shadow.
Yes.
Where it's sort of like there's almost no pretense that you were ever going to get a seat at the table.
Right.
Like if you look at the polling data, and obviously it's polling data, but the number of people my age who think they will ever own a home is vanishingly small.
Yeah.
And obviously, you know, there's certainly now Gen X has not caught up, but they are as a generation doing better, just obviously because of being older.
Right.
But at the same time, there was, I think, a similar feeling that the boat had kind of passed, you know, that like your chance to, and I guess this is what you see in a lot of quintessential Gen X media. Like I think of something like Fight Club or something like that, where it's like you were promised greatness and kind of by the time you got there, it was already gone. And the reason I want to say this is to make the connection. I think with Gen X, that feeling that the boat was gone was watching the baby boomers. You know, they got the opportunity. Whereas for millennials, I think the opportunity they were given was not necessarily economic, but it's this idea that you will be an important person. Like you can be social changer. You can have an audience. Correct. You can have your voice be important.
All get a ribbon and a trophy. That was that generation.
Right. And you are special because you care about something unique. You know, you know, you like this weird TV show or this video game, and you can talk about it. So you're important. Whereas I think for Gen Z, it was kind of like growing up in the era of fleeting internet fame. It's like, well, nothing matters, you know, this. And so I think that it's a similar mechanism applied to different media. And I think that kind of shapes the generational outlook. So sorry, that's a giant screed for what's supposed to be an interview of you, but
no. I mean, I'm going to have Matt and his co-host Cooper on and talk about this. I'm thinking like you need to be on too, because it's so funny and interesting that you haven't even, I assume, haven't heard their thesis on this on the last few weeks of they've been doing on.
No, I haven't.
Show. It is.
I know who they are.
I see what you're saying. I mean, it's like word for word exactly what you just articulated, and so it's nice to hear. Cooper, Matt's co-host, is Gen Z, and Matt is actually a millennial, although he's a very deep thinker, so he kind of feels his way through everything, and quite well. But yeah, this is precisely what they're saying. Everything you just said, and it's one of those things like it's like until I heard it said in such a way, it never clicked exactly. It's like those are the thoughts that are swimming in my mind, but I didn't put them in order. And so now they are in order, and I can't quit seeing it everywhere. Especially now, it's like I learn these things and understand this Gen X spirit that's rising up now and pushing this boomer stuff out of the way. And I like one of the comments said, "My fervent hope is that Gen X turns all the tables over, jumps on top, and yells obscenities at everyone." Well, not that I put all of my hope and faith in man, because I don't, but that's what Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones are doing right now. And if you look at it, the people that don't like what they're doing on a generic standpoint, now all of us can pick and choose. And I've got some, I wish Alex would mention, let's say, the country fighting Palestine right now, and less the country that's CHINA. But whatever the case.
Look, I'll put it this way. I have Thomas 77 on my show. Like,
you're good then.
So you're good. Like, okay. You're fine.
I wish they would talk about. Oh, okay. I wish they would talk about Israel and not China as much. Whatever. That's my personal stuff. But the case is, the people that don't like that, and let's say the last few people that have, to my face, called me a conspiracy theorist were boomers and millennials. Never a Gen Z person and never a Gen X person, even if it's someone in Gen X that I tend to generally disagree with politically. I have a friend that's my exact age. He's left wing. He leads with, let's say, I'm anti-racist and anti-homophobic, that kind of person. He leads with those things. But we both talk about the Kennedy assassination, and he says the CIA needs to be overturned and abolished. So, but it's that Gen X spirit in there that's like, well, still screw those guys, not boomers. They can't, even though they saw what happened to Trump. It was so clearly obvious with the CIA and FBI and these intelligence agencies. Well, I mean, as long as you get some new leadership in there, they're going to be good. And the millennials have this safe idealism too, where it's like, well, they can be good if we just did things. And Gen Z and Gen X are like, no, they can't. End it, abolish it. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm telling you what's going on. And so it's interesting to see this generational gap in kind of fall in line, or no, flip the tables over, because falling in line is making things worse.
So I think that part of it is, one, I think that the boomers were raised by television and are kind of raised to live out narrative, and that, AA, friend of the channel, has this idea of the boomer truth regime. That there are these kind of ideas, these memes in the true sense of that word, that are still living through that generation and the culture they created. And so I think that their children, Gen X, reacted against that and basically said, like, oh, you cannot trust these systems. And so I'm going to use a prime piece of Gen X media to explain this, The Matrix. Yep. So, The Matrix is that exactly. It's this idea that, there is this narrative you need to oppose. But there's a phrase in that, which I think is a quote from Baudrillard, or a paraphrase, where he talks about, like, welcome to the desert of the real. And I think that the reason that Gen Z has a lot of very severe structural problems because of this, has grown up in the desert of the real, right? That the narrative that so successfully formed the boomers fell apart, and they grew up in the internet, where there is effectively such any number of narrative and very little connection to fact at all, that essentially things become hyper real, right? That your specific narrative becomes more true than reality. Going back to what I said earlier about my feelings don't care about your facts.
Right.
And so on one hand, that's an advantage, because the main cultural narrative is terrible and will lead you to cut off your genitals and worship Satan, right? Yeah. So it's very bad. But at the same time, it's so fragmentary, that you have, and it's part of the reason that no one in Gen Z seems to be able to hang out with each other. And it's because they are not members of a culture, a real culture at all. They're a member of some small, infinitesimally, like, algorithmically sorted subculture. Yeah. And I do realize the irony of saying that on my own podcast.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
so do as I say, not as I do there. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, I think that that is specifically to this instance helpful, but has led to a lot of very negative side effects more broadly.
I know, and it's such a different set of negative side effects because it certainly affects the psyche, in my experience of seeing this so far. Although it seems to me like the millennials are affected more in their psyche than you guys, maybe because it's still Gen Z is so young. But look, I mean, look at what the boomers did. I mean, that is such it's it's just disastrous on a scale that's hard to comprehend. And you can say, well, you can't blame them for 9/11 or you can't blame them for COVID. It's like, yes, you can. This entire system that they've perpetuated has caused all of these things. And I mean, I hate to say it and sound like the old me, but there's people like Ron Paul have discussed this time and time again. Ron Paul's yelled into a room of no people about this type of thing. But this whole system they've perpetuated did cause all of these things. And it did cause this, like, now look at this runaway debt we're facing, Biden economics, all this craziness that we're still experiencing. The good thing is it's become such a joke and so laughable and such a clown world, as everyone calls it now. I think that finally a lot of people are just not accepting it anymore and don't like, no, I think most people, I could go out in my cul-de-sac right here and interview all my neighbors, and if I said, do you think Joe Biden's in charge? I think they would say no. So that's a good thing. Again, these shocks to the system, age of revelation, these things have to happen in order to progress through. I think it's should be a natural cycle. I think the boomers prolonged things to where it became unnatural, which is why it looks so ridiculous. That no generation of people stays in power and control of this system for as long as they have, but they're propping up the system that made them rich. And so they appreciate that. And they know that the second it changes, they're screwed. So that's the part of it. It's unnatural to do it this long, which is why it looks so absurd, in my opinion.
So I think that, and I don't know if I've ever said this on air, but are you familiar with the kind of traditional Christian explanation as to why man's life decreased after the flood?
I don't know.
So the argument is, and this is not, it's not canonized, right? It's
Right.
just kind of a recurring argument, is that essentially God saw that given that much life, right? Given a multi-100-year lifespan, humans
Yes.
could produce a lot of evil.
Yes.
And so since he promised never to destroy the earth again, he essentially
Right.
created this, I can't remember exactly how it's spread, but basically a 120-year cap on human life out of his own love. Right, basically saying, like, I don't want to see you sink to that level again.
Yeah, sink, get it? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that there's part of this, which is, as I've been reading more about, cyclical history, the cycle of civilizations, that the U.S. empire coming to an end, I think is actually a good thing.
Yes.
I think that it is become like moribund and corrupt and just this like sclerotic animal. And as someone who has gotten into hunting relatively later in life, seeing an animal like that, right, that is on one hand majestic, right? It's a big trophy buck or something like that.
Uh-huh.
But the reason an animal gets that big, right, is that it's about ready to die.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is a old animal. And so looking at, the American empire and seeing like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, this is my place. I love it. Or I love something that it ate, maybe, I guess, but it does need to go away, and it going away is not the end.
Correct.
And I've been on kind of a mini jihad against, Christian Zionism and dispensationalism recently.
Me too.
And one part of that is that the idea is that if the American empire ends, it must be the end of the world. And
correct.
That's not true.
No, it's idolatry. Right.
It is. And it's like, if there has ever been a truly apocalyptic battle where Christians lost, right, it's probably the fall of Byzantium.
Yes.
And I mean, it's been what, 500, 600 years since then. The world kept spinning. The
Right.
church continues to march on.
Right.
And us, or our polity, whatever you say, going away is not the end, and it might in a way be a very good thing. I don't know. Maybe I'll get a million
Well, the
people.
dispensationalists are certainly trying to lead us into that. That's what's mind-boggling to me about that terribly bad theology of the rapture and the dispensationalism and what's going on with Israel. It's like you're trying to cause the end of the world, I think, but the embarrassing thing for you is that you're theologically incorrect on what's happening. So it might cause the end of you and us because of you're getting in something that's way over your head, but they're doing it thinking like, oh, well, here's my ticket, out. And it's like, no, this is just the fact that you would think the church has gone through what it's gone through in the history of the world, and that it's not going to keep going after some war that you're trying to start thinking it's the end of the world is so prideful and such it's just based in demon theology that it's good theology inverted. And so that's what's frustrating to watch it happen. I grew up going to a church run by a guy named Pastor John Hagee, who's like the biggest Zionist on the planet right now, well, at least in America. And so I saw this. I saw his preaching. I know what they're saying, and I've read his books, and it's real bad theology. And so all I can, again, it's like do you rationalize something that's completely irrational? It's like we discussed earlier. I don't know where he's coming from. I don't know what's in the back of his mind. I know what's in his bank account because of it. So there's a lot of things that can make the human mind rationalize plenty of evil. It doesn't take much. And so millions and millions of dollars will easily do that. But the problem is politicians and military industrial complex people are influenced by that type of money, the type of money from Israel. And they want the end of the world because they think that that's biblical in the way they're going about it. The sad thing is it's not. So I don't know what's going to happen with that, but it's sure frustrating as an Orthodox Christian to see people just parading out their stuff that I know is factually incorrect, and that they're really the majority of the voting bloc is disheartening, I would say. But, I can't control that.
Well, one of the things that I think bothers me so much about this is that in many ways, these preachers, these kind of like cynical political actors, they're leading on good people,
Correct.
People who are
Yes.
kind of naturally our allies, who have,
I agree,
who have instincts for piety.
Yep.
Bagby, one of my good friends and mentors, he's also Orthodox, and he's in the Deep South. And he was taking his daughter to a homeschool co-op, right?
Uh-huh.
These have gotten kind of popular.
Yeah.
And while they were there, they had this ceremony where they were doing this thing where they like folded the flag, and with each kind of fold, they made some sort of declaration about America. And there was a line in it that basically said like, oh, this flag stands for, and I'm ruining the flow of it, but my point stands all the same. Like, this flag is for, the sanctity of human life, the sanctity of the unborn, and the Holy Trinity. And he was just sitting there, and he's like, one, that's quite a thing to say about any country at all,
right?
Let alone ours. Effectively, like, it would have been more honest to fold the progress flag, right, with all the like star or all the bands on it, right? That's effectively a more honest flag for the empire. And look, I don't say this like I am an American. I mean, I'd say more honestly than that, I'm Virginian. It's where I'm from. I love my home, but all the same, like this kind of like beast in Washington, right, is taking advantage of your good instincts. And let's be honest, like, patriotism is a good instinct. Piety is a good instinct, but it's a devil cloaked in light.
The mix of them without discernment between them is so boomer, though.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
That's the type of thing that's got to be burned to the ground and thrown out. That Gen X can't. I just don't think that's a spirit of boomerism that's demonic, and it has gotten us into way more trouble than it can ever get us out of. So to pretend that this country, this flag, represents anything to do with the Holy Trinity is beyond heretical, in my personal opinion. That flag is giving money to Ukraine, who is closing down the true Orthodox Church in Ukraine. It's giving money to Israel, and don't get me started on what that represents, but it's certainly not the Trinity. In fact, we all understand that if there's anything Israel represents, it's anti-Trinity. So those people that are being homeschooled in that environment, I hope your friend could at least educate him on some things.
Yeah, it's, I don't know. I'll put it this way. This goes back to my thesis about maybe the end of this being a good thing. But I think that there's I don't know, maybe this is just my kind of natural optimism, but the fact that things seem to not be working for them is kind of encouraging.
Oh, I love
You
it.
know,
Yeah.
like the fact that, I mean, look, like I feel an immense amount of sympathy for Ukrainians, but I'll be honest, guys, that project doesn't seem to be going so well.
Right.
You know, like, again, not a Russia guy either, but like, you know, just as a completely like uninvolved third party, just looking at it, you know.
Yep.
And I think that feeling that kind of the other shoe is waiting to drop in multiple areas at once.
Yes.
You know, there's been a long line of the conspiratorial tendency in American politics goes way back, right? So I've got to admit that. But on the other side, you know, really ever since the end of the Cold War, there's been this feeling of like, why does our country exist? You know, Thomas is good about this, basically saying that like the entire structure of America exists to fight the Cold War. And after that, it's sort of going through the motions, you know, trying to re-engineer that to kind of
find new enemies. Right.
Right. And so you have that from the top, but also just this idea that we can never kind of pick one thing and stick with it. You know, there's this never ending list of patronages that have to be paired off against each other, you know, and even in a situation where, like we said earlier, you know, where a like Machiavellian, you know, a really competent ruler would make a decision that would be heartless and evil. But, you know, like someone like Kissinger, you look at him and you're like, okay, well, that's a serious man. You know, he did what he thought needed to be done. Whereas now it's like that spirit of animus, you know, has like truly possessed the regime to the point where it is making poor decisions to kind of gratify that like animalistic urge to own the chuds. And the good news is when an elite starts to do that, there is a circulation, you know, and that doesn't mean they'll be our guys, but no, I don't think this regime has long to go.
No. All right. Yeah. I mean, you sound like you've read the Machiavellians.
Yeah, I have. Anyway, so we do have one super chat from Yevsey. Can I be certain the Jay Burton Show isn't part of an elaborate psyop?
No.
You cannot. I'll put it this way. If anyone is listening, I have so many phone numbers and so many connections to give. And with an appropriate bribe, that could all be yours. So I am not currently part of a glory organization, but for the right price, I could be. And I'll put it this way: it would take more than $5 Canadian because I think that comes out to after YouTube and conversion, like less than McChicken. I should say that was all a joke. I am a federal agent. Anyway, so Buck, if people want to find, you know, more of you and more of your work, what would be a good way for them to do that?
I would say easy way to do it is just go to the Counterflow Podcast YouTube channel, Counterflow Podcast with Buck Johnson. In fact, there's an episode about to premiere in 4 minutes from now, and hit subscribe. And they drop every Tuesday evening. You can follow me on Twitter at Buck Rebel, BuckRebel. Let's see. That's the easiest ways to do that. And I'm on obviously any podcatcher. Everyone knows how to figure that part out.
I have those linked, and you should head over to check the new show when it drops, and I'll be over there as well. And if you want to support my stuff, much like Buck's show, the Jay Burden Show is available anywhere you listen to podcasts: Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Odyssey, any one of the apps you use. If you want to support us more directly, well, you can do that by supporting our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. I've just started a new block, doing well, really suffering my way through a cut and not enjoying that at all. But it's good programming. JD really knows his stuff. And yeah, you should do it because you don't want to be fat. Anyway, Buck, again, thank you so much.
Yeah, man, this has been super, super, super impressive. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.